The late afternoon sun, usually a warm caress on Eleanor Vance's weathered face, felt like a judgmental glare today. It illuminated the chipped paint on her beloved '78 Ford Bronco, a vehicle that had been more than just a car. It had been a steadfast companion through decades of life's twists and turns. Now it sat in her driveway, the very place it had called home for 37 years, like a pariah. And the source of this sudden ostracism was a woman Eleanor had barely exchanged 10 words with, Brenda Sterling, her new next-door neighbor. Brenda had arrived with the silent efficiency of a seasoned invasion. Her immaculate beige SUV glided into the driveway one Tuesday morning, followed by a moving truck that unloaded minimalist furniture and an aura of sterile perfection. Eleanor, a creature of comforting clutter and the gentle hum of familiar routines, had offered a polite wave and a murmured welcome. Brenda had responded with a tight-lipped smile and a nod that felt more like a dismissal. The complaint had landed on Eleanor's doorstep, quite literally, 2 weeks later. A crisp white envelope bearing the embossed crest of the Homeowners Association lay accusingly on her welcome mat. Eleanor, a retired librarian whose days were now filled with tending her rose garden and devouring historical novels, had initially assumed it was a flyer or perhaps a notice about the upcoming neighborhood watch meeting. She'd picked it up with a sigh, already dreading the fluorescent lights of the post office if it turned out to be a bill. But as her fingers traced the official seal, a prickle of unease began to creep up her spine. The HOA, in their suburban utopia, usually only concerned themselves with excessively tall grass or rogue garden gnomes. This felt different. With a growing sense of dread, Eleanor carried the envelope inside, the familiar scent of lemon polish and old paper doing little to soothe her nerves. She settled into her worn armchair, the one with the floral upholstery that had absorbed countless cups of tea and whispered secrets. The Bronco, visible through the living room window, seemed to sag a little under the weight of her apprehension. Eleanor carefully slit open the envelope. The letter inside was a masterclass in passive aggression. It spoke of neighborhood aesthetics, property values, and the importance of maintaining a harmonious visual landscape. Then, in a paragraph that made Eleanor's stomach clench, it explicitly stated the complaint. It has come to the attention of the association, via a formal complaint filed by a resident, that a vehicle of considerable age and condition is being regularly parked in the driveway of 14 Maple Lane. This vehicle, identified as a 1978 Ford Bronco, is deemed to be detrimental to the overall appearance of the street and potentially impacts the desirability of neighboring properties. Eleanor reread the words, her breath catching in her throat. Detrimental? Impacting desirability? Her Bronco, lovingly maintained and a source of pride, was being described as an eyesore. The complaint, it was clear, came from Brenda. The mention of a resident was a thinly veiled reference, and Brenda was the only new resident. The sheer audacity of it made Eleanor's heart pound against her ribs. She stood up, the letter trembling in her hand. Her rose-patterned slippers padded across the hardwood floor as she walked to the window. The Bronco, a deep faded forest green, sat there stoically. Its chrome gleamed dully in the fading light, a testament to years of careful waxing. There was a small dent on the passenger side, a souvenir from a clumsy parallel parking attempt in her youth, and a faint rust spot near the wheel well, a battle scar from a particularly harsh winter. But these were marks of character, not decay. They told stories. Eleanor remembered the day she'd bought it. She was barely 21, fresh out of college, and bursting with the independence of a new driver. The Bronco had been a bold statement, a departure from the sensible sedans her parents had favored. It had carried her on road trips to national parks, hauled lumber for her first DIY projects, and served as a mobile office during her early years as a freelance writer. It had ferried her children to countless soccer games and school plays, its sturdy frame a comforting presence in their lives. Now, It was being judged by a woman who, Eleanor suspected, wouldn't know a carburetor from a coffee maker. A wave of indignation washed over Eleanor. This wasn't just about a car. It was about respect. It was about the right to enjoy her property, her home, her life, without being subjected to the petty judgments of someone who seemed to view the world through a filter of manufactured perfection. Brenda's perfectly manicured lawn, her meticulously pruned hedges, her silent, judgmental gaze. It all coalesced into a suffocating presence. Eleanor walked out onto her porch, the evening air cool and carrying the faint scent of honeysuckle. She stood beside the Bronco, running a hand along its familiar, cool metal. It felt solid, dependable. It wasn't a showpiece, and it certainly wasn't trying to be. It was a workhorse, a survivor, a piece of Eleanor's own history. She looked at Brenda's house, a starkly modern structure that seemed to absorb the surrounding nature rather than embrace it. No sprawling gardens, no quirky bird feeders, just clean lines and an unsettling quiet. Eleanor felt a surge of protectiveness for her own slightly overgrown, wonderfully lived-in space. The HOA letter had a deadline for response. A formal rebuttal was required. Eleanor gritted her teeth. She wouldn't be intimidated. She wouldn't be silenced. This was her home, and the Bronco was a part of it. And if Brenda Sterling thought she could dictate the terms of Eleanor's existence with a piece of paper and a manufactured grievance, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. The fight, Eleanor knew, had just begun. And for her beloved Bronco, she was ready to roar. The next morning, Eleanor found herself staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, the harsh fluorescent light highlighting the faint lines etched around her eyes. They weren't just wrinkles. They were the roadmap of a life lived, a life filled with laughter, tears, triumphs, and the occasional scraped knee. She splashed cold water on her face, trying to wash away the lingering unease from the HOA letter. Brenda Sterling. The name itself felt sharp, like a sliver of glass. Her arrival had been heralded by a hushed whisper from Martha Jenkins, the neighborhood gossip, who'd mentioned a very successful, very private individual moving into the old Miller place. Eleanor, ever content with her own quiet corner of the world, hadn't paid much attention. Now, she wished she had. The Bronco. Eleanor's gaze drifted to the window. The vehicle sat in its usual spot, a comforting presence in the morning light. It was a relic, she knew. Its paint was faded. Its engine sometimes rumbled with a sound that was more of a plea than a purr, and its air conditioning had given up the ghost sometime during the Clinton administration. But it was hers. It had been there when her children were born, its spacious interior a temporary sanctuary from the sterile hospital. It had been the chariot for countless birthday parties, its open windows filled with the joyous shrieks of children. It had carried her to her husband, George's side during his final days, its familiar hum a steady rhythm against the storm of her grief. The idea that Brenda Sterling, a woman whose age Eleanor couldn't quite pinpoint, but who exuded an air of manufactured youth, could deem her vehicle an offense was ludicrous. It was an affront, not just to Eleanor, but to the very concept of history and sentiment. Neighborhood aesthetics, property values, Eleanor scoffed. Brenda's house, a stark minimalist box, had done more to disrupt the charming, slightly ramshackle character of Maple Lane than any well-loved '78 Ford Bronco ever could. Eleanor pulled on her favorite gardening overalls, the faded denim a testament to years of digging, planting, and weeding. The scent of damp earth and blooming roses was a balm to her soul. She walked out into her garden, the morning dew kissing her bare ankles. The roses, a riot of crimson, blush, and sunshine yellow, were her pride and joy. They were vibrant, alive, and unapologetically themselves, much like her Bronco. As she deadheaded a wilting bloom, her mind replayed the brief, awkward encounters she'd had with Brenda. A strained nod across the fence, a hasty retreat when Brenda had approached while Eleanor was wrestling with a stubborn weed. Brenda's immaculate lawn, a perfect emerald carpet, seemed to mock Eleanor's own, slightly wild, wonderfully untamed garden. It was a stark contrast, a clash of philosophies. Brenda believed in control, in order, in the eradication of anything that dared to stray from her vision of perfection. Eleanor believed in life, in growth, in the beauty of imperfection. The HOA letter was still on the kitchen counter, a stark white rectangle of accusation. She knew she had to respond. But how? A polite letter explaining the sentimental value of a vehicle was unlikely to sway a committee likely comprised of individuals who measured life by their stock portfolios. No, this required something more. This required a strategy. Eleanor sat on the worn wooden bench in her garden, the morning sun warming her back. She closed her eyes, picturing the Bronco. Its sturdy frame, its broad shoulders, its unwavering loyalty. It had never let her down. It deserved to be defended. She didn't want a war. She was a librarian, for heaven's sake. Her battles were usually fought with overdue notices and the Dewey Decimal System. But Brenda Sterling had crossed a line. She had dared to judge Eleanor's life, her memories, her very home, based on the superficial appearance of a vehicle that was as much a part of Eleanor as her own heartbeat. A smile, small and determined, touched Eleanor's lips. She would respond. She would defend her Bronco. And she would do it in a way that Brenda Sterling, with all her sterile perfection, would never expect. The fight for Maple Lane's soul and for the dignity of a classic American automobile had officially begun. Eleanor Vance, with her trowel and her tenacity, was ready. Eleanor traced the faded forest green paint of the Bronco's fender with a calloused finger. The metal, cool beneath her touch, held the ghost of 1,000 summer drives, of road trips with her late husband Arthur, of hauling gardening supplies and lumber for DIY projects that Arthur had always cheerfully, if not always successfully, tackled. It was more than just a car. It was a rolling testament to a life lived fully, a life punctuated by the rumble of its engine and the occasional squeak of its aging suspension. Brenda Sterling, with her immaculate beige SUV and her unnervingly perfect lawn, wouldn't understand. She saw only rust spots and chipped paint, a blight on her meticulously curated vision of suburban tranquility. Eleanor saw a roadmap of a life lived, each imperfection a story, each scuff a memory. The complaint, tucked neatly into an official-looking envelope, lay on Eleanor's kitchen counter, a stark white intrusion amidst the comforting clutter of her home. The words swam before her eyes, each syllable a tiny barb. Unsightly vehicle, detrimental to aesthetic appeal. Property value depreciation. It was Brenda's handwriting, a precise, almost aggressive script that Eleanor recognized from the occasional neighborhood newsletter she'd begrudgingly contributed to. Brenda, the new queen of Maple Lane, had declared war on her beloved Bronco. Eleanor's initial reaction had been a hot flush of indignation, quickly followed by a wave of weary resignation. She'd dealt with petty grievances before. The occasional quibble over a slightly overgrown hedge or the placement of a garden gnome. But this felt different. This was an attack on something far more personal, a judgment on her very way of life. Brenda's arrival had coincided with a subtle shift in the neighborhood, a creeping desire for uniformity that Eleanor found suffocating. Brenda's house, a stark modern structure with sharp angles and an unsettlingly quiet aura, stood in sharp contrast to the comfortable lived-in homes that had characterized Maple Lane for decades, It was like a perfectly manicured, soulless showroom plopped down in the middle of a beloved, slightly chaotic family album. She walked back out to the driveway, the late afternoon sun warming her face. The Bronco sat proudly, its slightly weathered presence a testament to its enduring spirit. The chrome gleamed dully, reflecting the dappled sunlight filtering through the ancient oak tree that shaded her property. Eleanor patted the hood, a familiar, reassuring gesture. Arthur had bought it for her in '78, a bold, almost defiant choice in a world of sensible sedans. "It's got character, Elle," he'd said, his eyes twinkling. "Just like you." And it did. It had character in spades, a character that Brenda Sterling would likely find offensive. Eleanor wasn't one for confrontation, not usually. Her decades as a librarian had instilled in her a quiet patience and a deep appreciation for order and reasoned discourse. But this was not a matter of Dewey Decimal classifications or overdue book fines. This was about principles. This was about the right to hold on to what you loved, to cherish the tangible echoes of your past in a world that seemed increasingly determined to erase them in favor of the new and the sterile. She imagined Brenda, perched on her pristine porch swing, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair framing a face that rarely betrayed emotion, dictating her complaint into her sleek, cordless phone. Eleanor pictured her own home, a riot of floral upholstery and cherished knickknacks, a home filled with the scent of lemon polish and old paper, a home that Brenda likely viewed as a disaster zone. Her garden, a glorious, untamed explosion of color and fragrance, was probably another point of contention. Brenda's lawn, on the other hand, was a flawless emerald carpet, meticulously edged and uniformly green, devoid of any rogue dandelions or cheerful daisies. A sigh escaped Eleanor's lips, a soft exhalation of frustration. She knew the HOA rules were often vague, designed to be interpreted by the most zealous of enforcers. And Brenda, Eleanor suspected, was nothing if not zealous. She could already envision the upcoming HOA meeting, the hushed whispers, the disapproving glances directed her way. She would be the eccentric old woman with the ugly car, a relic out of time. But Eleanor Vance was not a relic. She was a woman who understood the value of history, the importance of sentiment, and the quiet power of resilience. She wouldn't be bullied into discarding a piece of her life simply because it didn't fit Brenda Sterling's narrow definition of acceptable. She wouldn't let her Bronco, her steadfast companion through so many years, be reduced to a mere object of aesthetic offense. Her mind began to churn, a familiar process of research and strategizing. She'd spent years helping patrons navigate complex systems, finding loopholes, and assembling persuasive arguments. This was no different, just louder and involving more paint. She needed to understand the exact wording of the HOA bylaws to see if Brenda's complaint held any genuine water or if it was merely an expression of her neighbor's personal pique. She decided her first course of action would be to meticulously document the Bronco's condition. Not in a way that excused its age. That was part of its charm. But in a way that highlighted its functionality and its history. She'd take photographs, not just of the exterior, but of the interior. The worn leather seats, the dashboard with its array of vintage gauges. She'd even dig out Arthur's old photo albums, find pictures of them with the Bronco, on their honeymoon, on trips to the coast, hauling their first Christmas tree. This wasn't just a car. It was a repository of their shared life. And then, she thought, a mischievous glint entering her eyes, there was the matter of Brenda's own property. While Eleanor's home might be a monument to comfortable clutter, Brenda's was a monument to almost frightening order. Eleanor suspected there were subtle violations, tiny cracks in Brenda's facade of perfection. Perhaps a sprinkler head that extended a millimeter too far, or a flower pot that was slightly off-center. It wouldn't be about digging up dirt. Not really. It would be about demonstrating that perfection was an illusion, and that even the most meticulously curated existence had its imperfections. She walked back into the house, the indignation still simmering, but now it was mixed with a growing sense of purpose. She went to her study, a room that smelled faintly of aged paper and dried lavender, and pulled out a thick binder labeled Maple Lane, HOA Rules and Bylaws. She'd read them cover to cover, absorbing every clause, every subclause. Brenda Sterling had underestimated her. She had filed a complaint based on superficiality, on a judgment of age and appearance. Eleanor Vance, however, would fight this battle with the tenacity of a librarian defending her beloved collection, armed with facts, sentiment, and a deep, abiding love for a faded green Ford Bronco. The rumble of its engine was the soundtrack to her life, and she wouldn't let Brenda's sterile silence drown it out. She would find a way, a clever, perhaps even unconventional way, to ensure that her Bronco, and the life it represented, continued to have a place on Maple Lane. The game, as they say, was afoot. The crisp, cream-colored envelope felt alien and intrusive in Eleanor's hand. It bore the official crest of the Maple Lane Homeowners Association, a stylized oak leaf that now seemed to mock her with its veneer of community and order. She'd found it tucked into her mailbox that morning, a stark white rectangle against the faded red of her own mail slot, a slot that had faithfully served her for 37 years. Inside, the typed words were polite, almost surgically so, but the message was a cold, hard slap. Notice of violation and request for compliance. Brenda Sterling, it stated, had lodged a formal complaint regarding a vehicle parked at Eleanor Vance's property deemed a significant detriment to neighborhood aesthetics and property values. It cited Section 4B of the HOA bylaws, a clause Eleanor vaguely remembered as pertaining to unsightly or dilapidated structures or vehicles. Dilapidated. The word stung, a sharp, unpleasant epithet aimed not just at her steadfast Bronco, but at the very essence of her life. Eleanor's gaze drifted to the driveway. There, bathed in the gentle morning sun, sat the object of Brenda Sterling's ire, her 1978 Ford Bronco. Its forest green paint, once vibrant, now bore the subtle patina of age, a testament to countless road trips, muddy excursions, and quiet evenings spent parked under the starry sky. The chrome gleamed dully, worn smooth in places by the touch of her hands. A faint, almost imperceptible rust bloom had begun to appear on the passenger side fender, a tiny imperfection that Eleanor found almost endearing, like a wrinkle on a beloved face. It was more than just a car. It was a repository of memories. It was the vehicle that had carried her through the early days of her marriage, the one she'd loaded with picnic baskets for spontaneous drives to the coast, the one that had patiently waited while she rushed into the library for a forgotten book, its engine a familiar, comforting rumble. It was, in short, a part of her. She walked over to the kitchen counter, the HOA notice laid out beside a half-eaten slice of toast, the scent of lemon polish and old paper. The comforting aroma of her home seemed to recede, replaced by an almost sterile emptiness. Brenda's house, a stark modern structure with clean lines and a lawn that looked as if it had been sculpted by a laser, sat just 3 houses down. Eleanor had only spoken to Brenda a handful of times since the Sterlings moved in last spring. Their interactions were brief, polite nods exchanged over meticulously manicured hedges. Brenda herself was a study in controlled perfection. Sharp, tailored clothing, a smile that never quite reached her eyes, and an almost unnerving ability to move through the world with a silent efficiency that Eleanor found both admirable and unsettling. Brenda's property was a testament to her values. immaculate, devoid of any personal clutter, a perfect emerald carpet of lawn stretching to the sidewalk, a minimalist landscape that spoke of control and a relentless pursuit of order. And now, Brenda Sterling, with her immaculate beige SUV parked precisely within the painted lines of her driveway, had declared Eleanor's Bronco an affront. A slow burn of indignation began to simmer within Eleanor. It wasn't just about the Bronco. It was about the underlying judgment. Brenda's complaint wasn't simply about a car. It was a statement about Eleanor herself, about her perceived lack of conformity, her refusal to adhere to some unspoken, sterile ideal of suburban living. Eleanor, who found solace in the riotous bloom of her roses and the comforting clutter of her bookshelves, was being told her life was too messy, too old, too lived in. She picked up the HOA notice again, tracing the official crest with her fingertip. Dilapidated. The word echoed in her mind, conjuring images of crumbling buildings and forgotten relics. But her Bronco wasn't a relic. It was a survivor. It was a testament to quality, to durability, to a time when things were built to last. Unlike Brenda's sleek, soulless SUV, the Bronco had character. It had a story. It had soul. Eleanor walked over to the bay window overlooking her driveway, her gaze fixed on the Bronco. She remembered the day she'd bought it, a young woman full of dreams and possibilities, the scent of new car leather mingling with the crisp autumn air. It had been a bold choice, a truck-like vehicle in a sea of sedans, but it had felt right. It had felt like her. Over the years, it had been her trusty steed, carrying her through life's adventures, big and small. It had been present for the joyous shrieks of her children on road trips, the quiet companionship on late-night drives home from the library, the silent comfort during moments of grief. It was a roadmap of a life lived fully, its dents and scratches not flaws, but etchings of experience. Brenda Sterling's complaint was an attack on that life, a demand for erasure in the name of aesthetic uniformity. Eleanor straightened her shoulders, a flicker of defiance igniting in her chest. She wouldn't let Brenda Sterling or the HOA dictate what was acceptable, what was beautiful, what was worthy of existing. She retrieved a well-worn, leather-bound ledger from a shelf in her study, its pages filled with her neat, cursive handwriting. This was her personal inventory, a meticulous record of her most cherished possessions. She opened it to the section dedicated to the Bronco. The entries detailed its purchase date, mileage, all major repairs, and even notes on its unique quirks. The way the passenger door sometimes stuck in humid weather, the specific pitch of its engine at 40 miles per hour. She began to add a new entry, her pen scratching purposefully against the paper. October 26, 2023. Received official notice from Maple Lane HOA, instigated by Brenda Sterling, neighbor 14 Maple Lane, citing vehicle as unsightly and a detriment to neighborhood aesthetics. Vehicle in question, 1978, Ford Bronco, forest green. Condition, excellent for age. All maintenance up to date. No mechanical issues impacting roadworthiness. Cosmetic wear consistent with a vehicle of this vintage, indicative of regular use and care, not neglect. This vehicle is a cherished possession, imbued with significant sentimental value and a history of reliable service. It is parked legally in my private driveway. Further documentation to follow. As she wrote, a plan began to form in her mind. She wouldn't simply respond to the complaint. She would build a defense, a testament to the Bronco's worth. She would gather photographs, maintenance records, even testimonials from anyone who had ever ridden in it and could speak to its character. She would meticulously document every detail, turning Brenda's accusation of dilapidation into a celebration of enduring quality. And then, a mischievous thought, a sliver of pure, unadulterated rebellion, entered her mind. Brenda Sterling, with her pristine lawn and her beige SUV, was so obviously a creature of order and precision. Eleanor wondered, with a growing sense of amusement, if perhaps Brenda's own property, so seemingly flawless, might have minor imperfections. A loose shingle, perhaps? A weed stubbornly pushing through the cracks in her pristine driveway? A bit of overgrowth on her meticulously trimmed hedges? Eleanor smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. It was a smile of resolve, of quiet determination, and of a burgeoning, delightful plan. The Bronco was not just a car, it was a symbol, and Eleanor Vance, retired librarian and proud owner of a perfectly imperfect Bronco, was not about to let anyone take away her symbols. She would fight, not with anger, but with the quiet, unyielding tenacity of a librarian defending her most beloved books. The game, as they say, was afoot, and Eleanor had a feeling she might just enjoy playing it. Eleanor traced the faded forest green of the Bronco's fender with a fingertip, the chipped paint a familiar landscape beneath her touch. It wasn't just metal and rubber, it was a rolling testament to a life lived, a faithful steed that had carried her through sunshine and downpours, through joyous road trips with Arthur and quiet commutes to the library. Brenda Sterling's complaint, tacked to her front door like a scarlet letter, felt like a personal affront, a judgment cast upon her very soul. Unsightly or dilapidated structures or vehicles, the HOA notice blared, its crisp, impersonal font a stark contrast to the warm, lived-in hues of Eleanor's own world. She'd spent the better part of the morning meticulously documenting the Bronco. Armed with her old Polaroid camera, the kind Arthur had bought her for their 10th anniversary, she'd captured every angle. Close-ups of the chrome bumper, still gleaming dully under a layer of dust. Shots of the tires, their treads worn but perfectly functional. Even a candid of the small rust spot near the passenger door, a badge of honor that Arthur had always promised to address, a promise that had evaporated with him. She'd circled these imperfections on printed photographs, ready to present them as proof of the Bronco's endearing character, not its decay. The thought of Brenda's immaculate beige SUV, parked with unnerving precision on her own pristine driveway, made Eleanor's jaw tighten. It was a sterile, soulless machine, devoid of any history, any hint of personality. It was the automotive embodiment of everything Brenda represented: conformity, a relentless pursuit of perfection, and a chilling disregard for anything that didn't fit her narrow definition of acceptable. Eleanor imagined Brenda's sharp, assessing gaze sweeping over her property, cataloging every perceived flaw, every deviation from her ideal. It was a masterclass in passive aggression, disguised as civic duty. A sigh escaped Eleanor's lips, a soft exhalation that stirred the scent of lemon polish and old paper in her study. She looked at the stack of documents on her desk. The HOA bylaw, her detailed notes, the photographs, and a preliminary draft of her rebuttal. It was more than just a defense of her vehicle. It was a defense of her values, of the quiet dignity of a life lived authentically. Arthur would have chuckled at the absurdity of it all, then patted her hand and told her to stand her ground. He'd always been her anchor, her staunchest supporter. She remembered the day she'd bought the Bronco with him. It was a dealership lot, sun-baked and smelling of new car plastic and ambition. The '78 Bronco, a bold statement in faded forest green, had called to them. Arthur, with his easy smile and his belief in her, had said, "Eleanor, that's your chariot. That's the one that's going to carry you through all your adventures." And it had. Adventures to antique shops, to weekend getaways in the mountains, to visit her sister in another state, and countless trips to the grocery store. The back of the Bronco often filled with bags of apples and the scent of freshly baked bread. Now, this violation notice. It felt like a trespass. She walked to the window, her gaze drifting towards Brenda's house. The lawn was an immaculate emerald carpet, meticulously edged. Not a single weed dared to mar its flawless surface. The flower beds, if one could call them that, were geometric arrangements of pale, uniform blossoms, devoid of the riotous, untamed beauty of her own roses. Brenda's house itself was a stark, modern structure, all clean lines and cool, neutral tones. It was beautiful, in a cold, sterile way, like a perfectly rendered architectural drawing come to life. But it lacked the warmth, the lived-in character that Eleanor cherished. A flicker of an idea, a small, mischievous spark ignited in Eleanor's mind. Brenda's perfection was so absolute. So perfect. Eleanor wondered, with a growing sense of amusement, if Brenda's own property was as flawless as she presented. Were there any stray leaves on Brenda's porch? Any slightly overgrown patches in her meticulously planned flower beds, perhaps obscured from Eleanor's usual vantage point? A sliver of glass, a tiny imperfection, could be a powerful counterpoint to Brenda's broad-stroke accusations. She'd need to do some reconnaissance. A casual stroll, perhaps. A friendly wave? She pictured herself, gardening overalls dusted with soil, trowel in hand, taking a leisurely walk around the block. It wouldn't be spying, not really. It would be observation, a neighborly assessment. The thought brought a small smile to Eleanor's lips. It was a tiny act of defiance, a way to reclaim some agency in this absurd situation. Brenda had thrown down the gauntlet, and Eleanor, a retired librarian who had spent her life surrounded by stories and the quiet pursuit of knowledge, was not about to be intimidated. Her Bronco, with its chipped paint and its rumbling engine, was a story in itself, a narrative of her life, and she would defend it with every ounce of her tenacity. She decided to tackle the documentation one more time to ensure absolute clarity. She retrieved a thick, well-worn photo album from a shelf in the living room. This wasn't just a collection of pictures. It was a visual autobiography. She flipped through pages filled with images of Arthur, his arms slung around her shoulders, their faces younger, brighter. There were photos of their wedding, the Bronco parked proudly in the background, gleaming as if it knew it was part of something special. There were snapshots of family picnics, the Bronco's tailgate open, laden with blankets and baskets, and there were candid shots of the Bronco itself, at different stages of its life, always a constant, a reliable presence. She carefully selected a few key photographs. One showed Arthur proudly polishing the chrome on the Bronco's grille, his face alight with pride. Another captured Eleanor, years later, loading Christmas presents into its spacious interior, the snow falling gently around them. These weren't just images. They were tangible proof of the Bronco's functionality, its enduring usefulness, and its deep sentimental value. They spoke of a life filled with purpose and love, a stark contrast to the sterile, unblemished facade Brenda seemed to champion. She then turned her attention to the bylaw itself. Any vehicle which is in a state of disrepair is dilapidated or is otherwise unsightly and detracts from the aesthetic appearance of the neighborhood. Eleanor underlined unsightly and detracts. These were subjective terms, open to interpretation. Her interpretation of unsightly was a car that was dirty, neglected, and clearly broken down. The Bronco, while not new, was meticulously maintained. It ran beautifully,